The winter of 1843 came to Aldermere not as weather, but as a verdict. It pressed against the tall windows of the great house with a gray and patient cold, and found every gap in the old stone seeping into the seams until the mortar wept and the cold owned the rooms. Frost stood on the inside of the glass by morning. The fountains in the south court had been let to freeze and crack, and no one had given the order to mend them, because the man who gave the orders had stopped caring whether anything was mended. Aldermere had been a house full of sound once. The neighbors 3 valleys over still spoke of it, the lamps and the laughter and the music that carried across the water on summer nights. But that was before. For 3 years now the house had held its breath, and a held breath, kept too long, becomes a kind of death of its own. The rule was the first thing every new servant learned, before the names of the corridors, before where the linens were kept, before the hour the master took his coffee. There would be no music at Aldermere, none. No singing in the scullery, no whistling on the stairs, no humming over the wash. The pianoforte in the long drawing-room stood under a gray holland sheet, like a coffin draped for burial, and the lid had not been lifted in 3 years. The 2 songbirds that had hung in gilded cages by the morning-room window had been given away to a cousin in the first month of mourning, cages and all, because the Duke could not bear the sound of them. The clocks were allowed to tick, for a clock keeps no tune. Everything else was silent. A footman had been turned out without a character once in the early days for being caught whistling a country air as he carried up the coal. After that, no one tested it. Into this frozen quiet, in the last cold week of January, came a woman who had nowhere else to go. Her name was Margaret Ainslie, and she was a widow of 31, though the road and the worry had aged her past her count. She wore a gown of gray worsted that had been turned and returned and made over from something better, the color of survival, the color of a woman who has learned not to be looked at. She had been a gentleman's daughter once, in a parish 2 counties south, and then a curate's wife, and then a curate's widow with a child and a stack of unpaid bills, which, in the world's eyes, made her nothing at all. The post at Aldermere had come to her through a registry office, and a letter so cold it had frightened her more than poverty did. It described not the woman the house wanted, but the woman it would not tolerate, not nervous, not given to chatter, not curious about the family's affairs. Above all, the letter said, the housekeeper must understand and enforce the silence of the house and require it of every soul beneath her. The wage offered was 3 times what such a post should pay, and Margaret had read that figure twice and understood, the way one understands a closed door, that a wage like that is paid to keep something hidden. She did not come alone. Beside her on the carrier's cart, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the season, sat a child of 6 years with dark, solemn eyes and a face that had forgotten how to be a child's face. This was Beatrice, her daughter, and Beatrice had not spoken a single word in 2 years. The doctors in the South had called it many things and cured none of them. The child could hear. She could understand every word said to her, and she would point and nod and shake her head, and once in a great while she would weep without a sound, which was the worst thing of all to watch. But she would not speak, and she would not sing, and she would not make any sound that came from her own throat by her own will. Margaret had stopped explaining it to people, for explanations only brought the pity, and the pity was harder to carry than the silence. She had taken the post at Aldermere for the wage, and for one reason besides. A house that forbade all music was perhaps the one house in England where a silent child would not be remarked upon. Here at least no one would ask the girl to sing. The carriage came up the long drive in the failing light, between rows of bare and dripping limes, and the house rose out of the gray like something half asleep. It was vast and beautiful and wrong, the way a person can be beautiful and wrong, too still, too pale, the curtains drawn in rooms that should have shown light. A manservant met them at a side door, for the great front doors were not opened for housekeepers. He looked at the child a long moment and said nothing, and Margaret understood that the silence here was not only a rule, but a weather. The steward who received her was a thin gray man named Hollis, who had served the family 30 years and seemed to have given his own voice up to the house's mourning long ago. He went through her duties in a murmur barely above the fire's hiss, the hours, the keys, the accounts, the staff, and then he came to the rule, and here his voice did not rise, but it did slow, and each word was set down separate and heavy, so there could be no mistaking it. There is no music at Aldermere, he said, none. His grace does not permit it, and his reasons are his own, and they are not to be discussed below stairs nor above. You will see that it is kept by every servant in every wing at every hour. Margaret said that she understood. Hollis looked at the child then, at Beatrice standing close against her mother's skirts, and something moved behind his tired eyes that might once have been kindness. "The little one," he said. "Will she keep it?" And Margaret, with a steadiness that cost her more than he could know, answered that her daughter would give him no trouble on that account. "She has not the habit of singing," she said, and left it there, and Hollis did not ask the thing that lay under those careful words. That night, with the child asleep on a narrow cot in the housekeeper's room off the kitchen passage, Margaret stood at the small window and let herself feel, for one moment only, the size of what she had taken on. Then she folded it away, as she folded everything, and went to her work. The first weeks taught her the shape of the silence. It was not empty. That was the thing no one warned her of. A silence kept on purpose is full to the brim, full of all the sound it is holding down. She heard it in the careful way the maids set down a tray, in the felt slippers the older footmen wore so their steps would not ring on the marble. They were not unkind to her exactly. They were frightened, all of them, in the patient, bone-deep way of people who have lived a long time inside another person's sorrow. The cook, a broad, red-faced woman named Mrs. Pell, took to the child at once and slipped her bits of warm bread and never once asked why the girl did not chatter as children do. The kitchen was the only warm room in the house, and Beatrice took to sitting in the corner of it by the great hearth, watching the fire, while her mother went about the business of governing a house that did not wish to be governed back to life. It was Mrs. Pell who first put words to the thing the others only carried. She came in one gray morning from the cold larder, stamping the chill from her feet, and found Margaret counting candle ends at the long deal table. And she set down her basket and looked at the child by the hearth and then at the mother, and she said it low, so the girl would not hear. "You'll want to keep her close to this room," she said. "There's corners of this house that swallow a body." Margaret asked what she meant. Mrs. Pell wiped her hands on her apron and was quiet a moment, choosing. The mistress used to walk them all, she said, the galleries, the long room, the music. Now nobody goes where she went, save him at his portrait, and the dust just sits. She nodded toward the passage. A child gets curious. Keep her where I can see her, and we'll come to no grief. Margaret said that she would, and meant it, and did not yet know how soon the keeping would slip her hands. She saw the Duke for the first time in her second week, and she did not know it was the Duke. She had risen before light to go over the stores in the cold larder, and as she crossed the great stone hall in the blue dark, she saw a man standing at the foot of the main stair with his back to her, very still, looking up at a portrait she could not see. He wore no coat against the cold, only his shirt and an old dark dressing gown, and his dark hair was uncombed, and he stood bowed and motionless before the painted face above him, a mourner at a graveside. She took him at first for some grieving relation given the run of the house, and she murmured a good morning and moved to pass. He turned, and she saw his face, and she knew. It was a young face for all its hardness, perhaps 32, with a sharp jaw gone unshaven, and dark eyes sunk in shadow, and the eyes, when they found her, held no warmth and no welcome, only a kind of dull surprise that the house still contained living people he did not recognize. He looked at her gray gown and her chapped hands and her plain, tired face, and dismissed all of it in a single glance, the way the very great dismiss the very small. "You are the new housekeeper," he said. It was not a question, and his voice was low and rusted, as though he used it rarely. "I am, your grace," Margaret answered, bending her head. "I came up to see to the stores." He looked at her a moment longer. "Then you know the rule of this house," he said. "There is to be no music here, none, not a note, not a hum, not so much as a tune whistled on the stairs. Do you understand me?" It was not asked as a question either. Margaret kept her eyes lowered and her voice level. "I understand it, your grace," she said. "The steward told me plainly. It will be kept in every wing and at every hour. You have my word on it." She did not promise it lightly, and she did not let it tremble, and perhaps it was the steadiness of it that made him look at her twice. The Duke's gaze went past her, back toward the cold and the dark stair. "See that it is," he said. "There is nothing in this house that I want disturbed." And he said no more. Then he turned back to the portrait, and Margaret understood she had been forgotten while she still stood there, and she went on to the larder with her heart beating hard. That was Alaric Vane, the 6th Duke of Aldermere, and the portrait he stood beneath every dawn was of his wife, who had died 3 years before in the spring, of a fever that took her in 9 days from a laughing young woman to a body in the family vault. Her name had been Eleanor. The whole of the house's frozen sorrow was the size of that one absence, and the silence was the shape grief had taken when a man could find no other shape for it. He had loved her, the maid said, in the low, frightened way they said anything, loved her past sense, and she had filled the house with music because she could not help it, sang at her needlework, played late into the night, and he had loved that most of all. And so when she died, he could not bear one note of it, because every note was her, and the silence had grown around him like ice around a stone. Margaret learned all this in pieces, the way one learns anything below stairs, and did not let it soften her, because softness was a thing she could not afford. She had a house to run and a child to keep safe and a wage to earn that would mean a future for them both. She did her work well. The accounts that had run wild for 3 years she brought to order. The damp in the west rooms she set the men to fighting. She was firm and fair and quiet, and the staff, who had braced for a hard woman to match the hard house, found instead one who governed without raising her voice, who never gloated over a fault she corrected, who, when a frightened scullery maid broke a whole tray of the second-best china, only said that china could be replaced and the girl could not, and to mind her step on the wet stair next time. Slowly, without anyone marking the day, the house below stairs began to breathe a little easier around her. But the silence above stairs held. The shrouded pianoforte stood beneath its gray sheet, and Margaret passed it 12 times a day, and she never looked at it twice. She had her own reasons not to wake sleeping music. And then there was the child. Beatrice, in those first weeks, was a shadow at the edge of every room. She helped her mother where small hands could help. She carried linen and counted spoons, and stood very still and watchful in corners, and the house with its great hush seemed almost to suit her, as if she had at last come to a place that asked of her exactly what she had to give, which was nothing, which was silence. But a child cannot live forever as a shadow, and there was one thing in the house that Beatrice could not keep from. It was the shrouded pianoforte. Margaret found her there 3 times before she understood it was not chance. The girl would slip away from the warm kitchen and be found at last in the cold music room, standing before the sheeted instrument, one small hand lifted as if to touch it and never quite touching, her dark eyes fixed and hungry on the shape of it under the cloth. The first time, Margaret led her away with a low word of warning. The second time, she did the same, more sharply, with her heart in her throat, for of all the rooms in England, this was the one her daughter must never make a sound in. The third time, she knelt and took the girl by the shoulders and looked into her face, and saw something there that frightened her worse than any rule. She saw longing. The child wanted the thing under the cloth with a want so old and so deep it had outlived her voice. It was after that third time that the girl found the first of Eleanor's small, left-behind things. In her closed fist, when Margaret pried the cold fingers open in the kitchen, lay a little carved ivory songbird no bigger than a thumb, yellowed with age, fallen long ago behind the instrument's leg, and forgotten. Mrs. Pell came over and looked at it in Margaret's palm and went still. That was hers, she said quietly. She kept it on the music rack to mind her of the birds he gave away. I'd thought it lost with the rest. Margaret would have taken it from the child, but Beatrice closed her hand back over it and held it to her chest and would not give it up, and her dark eyes, when they came up to her mother's, were not pleading, but certain, the way a child is certain of the one thing in the world that is hers. Margaret let her keep it. The girl slept that night with the little ivory bird shut in her fist, and it was the first thing in 2 years she had wanted enough to hold. Margaret did not know yet what that longing meant. She would learn it from an old woman's mouth soon, in a single sentence that would break her open. But not yet. For now she only led her daughter away again, and held her close that night, and stroked her hair, and grieved in her quiet, folded way for whatever it was the child carried that she could not say. The thaw, when it began with the dog. There was a deerhound at Aldermere, a great rough gray beast the size of a small pony, named Bran, who had been the Duchess's own, and who had not, the maid said, gone willingly to any human hand since she died. He kept to the cold halls and the stable-yard, and let no one near him, and the Duke, who could not bear to part with the creature nor keep it close, had let it become another haunting in a haunted house. Beatrice was not afraid of the dog. She was afraid of almost nothing made of fur or feather, only of the sounds inside her own throat. And one gray afternoon, Margaret came up from the cellars to find her daughter sitting on the cold flags of the great hall, with her thin arms wound round the neck of that enormous half-wild dog, her face pressed into its rough coat, and the dog lying still as stone and letting her, its great head lowered, its eyes half closed, as if it too had been waiting 3 years for someone small enough and silent enough to grieve with. Margaret stopped in the archway and did not move. And it was then she saw that the Duke was there too, at the top of the stair, watching, his hand white on the banister, watching the dog that had refused him for 3 years lie down for a silent child. He did not speak. After a long moment, he turned and was gone. But Margaret had seen his face before he turned, and the dull ice in it had cracked just at the edge, and underneath the crack was something raw. If you are finding warmth in this quiet house tonight, do stay with us to the end and take a moment to subscribe, so that more of these stories can find their way to you on the long, cold evenings. Now let us go back to Aldermere, where the silence had begun, very faintly, to listen. The old woman came in February, and she brought the truth with her. She was the dowager, the Duke's grandmother, a tiny, upright woman of near 80, named Lady Augusta, who lived in the dower house across the park and came to the great house, but rarely, because, she said plainly to Margaret over tea on her first visit, she could not abide a tomb, and her grandson had made the place into one. She had sharp black eyes that missed nothing, and a tongue that had outlived all patience with grief, and she took to Margaret at once, in the brisk way the very old take to the few people who do not flatter them. It was Lady Augusta who saw the child by the pianoforte on her second visit, saw the small hand lifted to the shrouded shape and not quite daring, and it was Lady Augusta who watched it with her sharp old eyes, and then said something low to Margaret that Margaret did not hear, and beckoned her aside into the cold morning room and shut the door. "The child does not speak," the old woman said. It was not a question. Margaret said no, she did not, and had not for 2 years, and the doctors could find no cause in her body for it. Lady Augusta looked at her a long moment and asked how it had begun, and Margaret, who had told this to no one in 2 years, found that she could not refuse those old eyes, and she told it. "The father," she said, "my husband. He took a fever in the winter 3 years past, and he was a long time dying, near a fortnight, and Beatrice was 4, and would not leave his side. She sang to him. He liked to hear her sing. She had a sweet little voice, and he loved it past anything, and so she sang to him through all of it, the hymns he knew, every hour she was let, to comfort him. Margaret's voice did not break, because she had long since worn that part of herself smooth, but her hands tightened in her lap. And he died, she said, while she was singing. In the middle of the verse, she was singing, and then he was gone, and she has not made a sound from that day to this." Lady Augusta was silent for a moment. Then she said the thing that broke Margaret open, said it quietly. the way the truest and most terrible things are always said. "The child thinks she did it," she said. The old woman's eyes did not leave Margaret's face. She does not believe her voice failed to save him. She believes her voice killed him. She sang, and her father died, and a child of 4 cannot tell the difference between after and because. She has spent 2 years believing her own voice is a poison. That is why she will not speak. That is why she will not sing. She is keeping the poison shut in her own mouth to keep it from killing anyone else. The room was very cold and very quiet. Margaret sat with her hands in her lap and felt the floor of her own life tilt, because she had carried this child 2 years and never once seen the shape of it whole, and now an old stranger had named it in a sentence, and she knew past doubt that it was true. She had been treating the silence as a wound to be healed. It was not a wound. It was a child standing guard over a poison she believed she carried, holding her own throat shut, year on year. And no doctor in England could mend a thing like that, because it was not in the body. It was a thing only love could reach, and only by the most patient and dangerous road, which was to lead the child back to the very thing she feared. Before she rose to go, Lady Augusta laid her dry old hand over Margaret's on the table and held it there. "I buried 2 of my own," she said, "and a husband, and I will tell you what no doctor will. Grief is not water to drain away. It is a guest that will not leave until it is given a chair at the table. Your girl has given hers the whole house." She squeezed once hard and let go. "Stop trying to put the guest out," she said. "Set it a place." And then she gathered her shawl and went out across the frozen park and left those words behind her like a key on the table, and Margaret sat a long while before she could lift it. That winter, Margaret began very gently to do an impossible thing in a house where music was forbidden. She began to give her silent daughter her voice back. She did it in the cold hours and the hidden corners where the rule could not catch them. She did not ask the child to sing, for to ask was to frighten her. She only let music exist a little near her. She would hum, almost soundlessly under her breath, as she folded linen with the girl beside her, the old country airs of her own childhood, so low it could hardly be called a sound, and watch the child's face and stop the moment fear came into it. She would tap a rhythm on the table, 2 fingers, the way one might idly drum, and let the girl tap it back, because that was sound the child made with her hands and not her throat, and so it was safe. Hands first, then, by the smallest degrees, breath. She taught the child to blow across the top of a bottle to make a low note, a sound that came from the mouth but not from the dread place in the throat, and Beatrice, after long fear, did it and made a low, soft hoot, and something flickered across her solemn face that her mother had not seen in 2 years, which was the ghost of delight. One night, late, the bottle made a noise louder than they meant, a long, low moan of a note that carried out into the passage, and they both froze, and a moment later Hollis appeared in the kitchen doorway with a candle, his gray face long with alarm. Margaret rose at once between him and the child. "I was testing a cracked bottle for the cellar," she said, steady as stone, holding his eyes. "It will not happen again." The old steward stood there, and his gaze went past her to the girl in the corner with the bottle still in her 2 hands, and to the little ivory bird on its string about the child's neck, and Margaret saw him understand slowly exactly what he was looking at. For a long breath she thought he would speak, and her whole future hung on it. Then the steward lowered his candle, and his shoulders, that had been held stiff for 3 years, came down a little. "Mind the cracked ones," he said softly. "They carry further than you'd think." And he went away down the dark passage, and never said a word of it to anyone. And that was the first time anyone at Aldermere had chosen, knowing, to let a sound live. They were small things, foolish things, a humming and a tapping and a bottle, done in cold corners by candlelight, and they were the bravest work Margaret had ever undertaken, because every one of them walked the child one step closer to the cliff she had spent 2 years backing away from. And all the while, above stairs, the Duke was thawing too, though neither of them had a word for it. It was the dog that drew him first, and then the child the dog loved, and then by degrees he did not mark, the quiet gray woman who governed his house without ever once seeming to want anything from him. He came down to the hall in the afternoons now, and stood near where the dog lay with the child, and once Margaret found him there, the 3 of them, the man and the dog and the silent girl, all quiet together in the gray light, and the man's face had lost some of its hardness in that quiet. He began, awkwardly, to speak to Margaret of small things, the accounts, the damp, the stores, the things a master speaks of to a housekeeper, and then, by and by, of things no master speaks of to a housekeeper. It was on one of those gray afternoons that he saw the ivory bird. Beatrice had fallen asleep against the dog with her hand fallen open, and the little carved thing lay in her palm, and the Duke crossed the hall and went down on one knee and looked at it without touching, and his breath changed. "Where did she come by this?" he said very low. "Behind the pianoforte, your grace," Margaret answered. "Fallen and forgotten. She has had it some weeks. I would have returned it to you, but she will not be parted from it." The Duke was quiet a long moment, his eyes on the small yellowed bird in the sleeping child's hand. "I carved it," he said at last, "for Eleanor, the first winter we were wed. She told me the birds I gave her would not sing in the cold months, so I made her one that needed no season. She kept it where she could see it while she played." Margaret looked at the small worn thing, and then at his bowed dark head. "It is a tender thing to have made," she said gently. He gave a short breath that was not quite a laugh. "I was a different man then," he said. "I did not know yet that a person could be taken in 9 days. 9 days, and a house that had laughed for 100 years went quiet." He drew his hand back slowly. "I had thought every last thing of hers was either locked away or buried with her, and here's one found by a child who never knew her, kept warm in her sleep." "Then let it be hers, your grace," Margaret said, very quietly. "Some things are meant to be held, not shut away." He rose and went to the window and stood with his back to the room, and Margaret did not break the quiet, and after a while he said, without turning, "Let her keep it. It is in better hands than mine." There was one gray afternoon, before the worst of the thaw, when his guard rose against her without warning. She had said some small ordinary thing, that the morning room caught the best of the winter light and was a pity to keep shut, and his face closed like a door. "You forget yourself," he said, very low and very cold. "You are the housekeeper of this house, not its mistress, and you will not tell me which of my rooms to open. Leave me." Margaret did not flinch, and she did not flee. She stood where she was, her hands folded, and met the cold of him with a quiet of her own. "I will go, your grace, if you wish it," she said. But I have buried someone I loved, and I will say one thing before I do. A shut room does not keep them. It only keeps you in the dark with them. For a moment she thought he would dismiss her from the house entirely. Then the hardness went out of him all at once, and he turned away to the window and said in a different voice, "Stay. I did not mean it. Stay." And she stayed, and after a long silence he began, almost against his will, to speak. He told her, looking out at the frozen fountains, that he knew the house was a tomb, and that he had built it himself, stone by stone, out of the only material he had, which was the refusal to feel anything at all. He said he had thought in the beginning that if the house were silent enough, he might be able to hear her still. And then he had found that the silence held nothing, that he had shut out the world and gained no part of her by it, and that he no longer knew how to undo what he had done, because the silence had become the only place he was still allowed to keep her. Margaret did not pity him. That was the thing he could not get over afterward. Everyone for 3 years had offered him pity, and pity was a soft thing you could lean on forever and never rise from. Margaret offered him none. She only listened, and once quietly she said that her own husband had died with a song in the air, and that she had hated music for a year after for the cruelty of it, and then had come to think that the song had not killed him, that it had been the last kind thing his ears ever knew, and that there was a difference, though it had taken her a long while to find it. She did not say it to teach him anything. She said it because it was true, and because he had spoken truth to her first. But the Duke heard it, and it lodged in him. He did not know when she said it that she was speaking of her own child as much as of herself. She did not know when she said it how soon she would have to make those words real or watch them fail. The thing that no one planned came on a gray afternoon in the 3rd week of March, when the light was the color of pewter and the house was empty of its usual hands. Mrs. Pell was at the home farm. The maids were turning out the east rooms. The Duke had ridden to the village, and Margaret had gone down to the cellars to wait on the brewer, and Beatrice, for the first time in many days, was left a little while to herself by the kitchen fire. And the pull that the child had felt from the first day, the longing for the shape under the gray cloth, the want older and deeper than her fear, drew her up out of the warm kitchen and along the cold passages and into the music room alone to the shrouded pianoforte. What moved in the child in that empty room no one will ever fully know. Perhaps it was the dog who had taught her that grief could be shared in silence and survived. Perhaps it was her mother's humming, which had made music a thing that lived in the world again and did not kill. Perhaps it was the little ivory bird warm in her fist, the made thing of a woman who had loved this room. Perhaps it was only that a child of 6, left alone before the one forbidden wonderful thing, will at last reach out and touch it. She lifted the gray cloth at one corner. Underneath was the dark gleam of the wood and the long row of the keys, white and black, patient, asleep. Beatrice stood before them a long time. Then she lifted one small finger, and she pressed down a single key. A note rang out into the silence of Aldermere. It was one note, a clear, high, single note, the first sound of music to be heard in that house in 3 years, and it hung in the cold air of the long drawing-room and would not die. It went on and on into the corners and up the great stair and along the frozen halls, one pure trembling note breaking 3 years of held breath. and the child stood frozen with her finger still on the key, and her dark eyes huge, terrified at what she had done, terrified of the note, as if it were a thing that might turn on her, and she did not run, because she could not move. The Duke had come home early. He was in the hall, still in his riding coat, the cold of the road on him, when the note rang out above him, and he stopped as a man stops who has been struck. For 3 years he had built a silence to hold his grief, and now, from the heart of that silence, one note of music came down to him, and it was a child's hand that made it, and he could not for one long moment tell whether the thing rising in him was rage or grief. And then he was moving up the stair toward the room, and his face as he came was not a face that should be brought into a room where a frightened child stood guard over a poison she believed she carried. Margaret heard the note in the cellar and knew it for what it was, knew it in her body before her mind could name it, and she was already running up the cellar stair, along the passage, her heart a stone in her throat, toward the one disaster she had crossed 2 counties to prevent. She came into the room from the servant's door. At the same moment the Duke came through the great one, and so they arrived together, the man and the mother, to find the child standing at the open pianoforte with her finger on the key, and her whole small body rigid with fear, looking from one of them to the other, waiting to be told that she had done it again, that the music had come out of her again, and that something was going to die. The Duke stood in the doorway. Margaret saw the war in him, saw the 3 years of forbidding rise up in his face, saw his mouth open. "Who?" he said, and the word came out of him cracked and terrible, his eyes fixed on the child's hand, still resting on the key. Who told her she could touch it? His voice rose, shaking, 3 years of held grief breaking loose at once. "Take it back. Take that sound back. There is no music in this house." But even as he said it, his face was not only anger, it was a man drowning, and the child flinched as if the words themselves might strike her, and Margaret did the only thing left to her, which was to put her own body between the man and the child, and to speak, low and steady, not to the Duke at all, but to her daughter. "It was not your fault," Margaret said. The words were quiet, and they filled the room. The child's eyes came to her. "Not then," said Margaret, kneeling now slowly on the cold floor, holding the small terrified gaze with her own. "And not now. Your voice did not do it, Beatrice. It never did." The child began to shake her head, small and fast, the old denial, the 2-year refusal, no, no, and the tears came at last, the silent, terrible tears. Margaret did not look away. "Listen to me," she said. "He died, and you were singing, and you have thought ever since that the song was the knife." Her own voice was steady, though everything in her was breaking. It was not the knife. The song was the last kind thing he heard in this world. He died smiling, my love, because his girl was singing to him. That is not poison. That is the kindest thing a person ever did for him in his life. And the child stood shaking her head and weeping without a sound, and Margaret held out her arms there on the cold floor and said the last of it. "Your voice is not death," she said. "It is the most alive thing you have. Give it back to me. I have missed it so." For a long moment nothing happened. The note had long since died away. The house held its breath. The Duke stood in the doorway and did not move and did not speak, and his face was wet, though he did not seem to know it. And then the child, still weeping, still shaking, lifted her free hand and pressed it back down on the keys, soft this time, a low, gentle chord, and over it, cracked and frail as a hinge that has not turned in an age, came a single thread of sound from the child's own throat. It was a note. It wavered and nearly failed, and then it held. Beatrice was singing. It was the smallest, most broken scrap of song, hardly a tune at all. But it came from her own mouth, by her own will, for the first time in 2 years, and her mother knelt on the cold floor with her arms open and her own tears falling, and did not move for fear of breaking the spell, and let the child come to the song in her own time, note by trembling note. And then Margaret heard the tune. She had not chosen it. The child had reached for it on her own, out of some deep, unmarked place. And it was a melody Margaret did not know, a soft, slow falling air, a lullaby. And from the doorway came a sound she had never heard from the Duke, a single broken breath, and Margaret turned and saw that he had gone white, gone to the wall for the support of it, and that he was looking at the child as a man looks at the dead come back. He knew the tune. Margaret saw that he knew it, and that it was unmaking him. The child sang on, frail and small, the falling lullaby, her finger picking out the low chord beneath, and the Duke pushed himself off the wall and crossed the room as if walking through deep water, and went down on his knees beside Margaret, beside the child, this great, cold, grieving man on the floor of his own forbidden room, and when he spoke, his voice was a ruin. "That song," he said. The child stopped, afraid, and he shook his head quickly. "No, no, go on, please." And his hand half lifted toward her and stopped, trembling. That was her song, he said to Margaret, not taking his eyes from the child. Eleanor's. She made it. There are no words to it. She never wrote them down. She only sang it at night. She sang it to the house. He could hardly get the words out. No one living knows that tune but me. No one has heard it in 3 years. I have not let myself remember how it goes. And this child, he said, this child who has never heard it, who has never heard any music in this house, has found it out of the air and sung it back to me. His breath broke. How? How does she know it? I do not know, Margaret said softly, kneeling beside him with her arm about the child. I have stopped asking how, in this house. The Duke turned his ruined face to her. You knew, he said. You knew what your girl carried, and you brought her here to the one place in England where music was forbidden. Why? And Margaret looked at him steadily, the tears bright on her own face. Because she had to be brought back to the very thing she feared, she said, and there was no other way under heaven to do it but slowly and in secret and with love. I did not mean for it to be your room, your grace. I am sorry it was. The Duke shook his head, slow and broken. Do not be sorry, he said. Do not ever be sorry. Then his voice failed altogether, and he could only look at the singing child. And Margaret had no answer to the deeper question, only the knowledge that there are things in a grieving house that pass between the living and the gone-by roads no one can map, and that it did not matter how. What mattered was the child's small voice, going on now, gathering, finding the fallen air and following it down, and the great man kneeling with the tears running unchecked down his unshaven face, listening to his dead wife's song sung by a living child in a house he had sealed against all music. He did not stop her. He did not reach for the gray cloth to cover the keys again. He knelt on the floor of his tomb and let the music tear it open, let it in, let it do its long-deferred work. And when at last the child's frail song came to its end, he did not speak for a long while. Then he reached out, slowly, and laid his great hand very gently over the child's small one on the keys, and pressed it down with her, the two of them together, and the low chord sounded once more into the room, and he said, in a voice scraped down to nothing, "Thank you, thank you. Sing it again." She sang it again. That was the day the silence broke at Aldermere, and it did not heal all at once, for nothing real ever does. But it began, from that hour, to undo itself. The grey cloth came off the pianoforte and was not put back. The Duke had the songbirds' cages brought down from the attic and sent to the cousin in the next county, with a letter asking, very humbly, if he might have the birds back. And the cousin sent them, and they sang in the morning-room window again. The rule of silence was never formally lifted because it did not need to be. It simply died, the way frost dies, all at once and then not at all, room by room, as the house remembered it was allowed to make sound. The maids sang over the wash again. Mrs. Pell hummed in her kitchen, and Beatrice, who had carried a poison that was never a poison, found her voice come back to her by slow degrees over that spring. First the song, and then, weeks later, on an ordinary morning, a single spoken word. It happened in the warm kitchen, with the spring light at the window and Mrs. Pell at her bread. Margaret was plaiting the child's dark hair when Beatrice turned in her hands and looked up and said, in a small cracked voice that had not formed a word in 2 years, "Mother." That was all. One word. Margaret went very still, her hands frozen in the child's hair, and then she gathered her up, bread and braid and all, and held her, and could not speak herself for the longest while. "Yes," she said at last into the child's hair. "Yes, my love, I am here." And Beatrice, with 2 years of silence breaking open behind that one word, said it again, and then said bread, and then said Bran, the dog's name, and then said, looking toward the door where the Duke had appeared, drawn by Mrs. Pell's glad cry, "Is he sad still?" And the Duke came and knelt by them on the kitchen flags and said, "No, little one, not any more. You have seen to that." Then came 2 words, and then the flood of 2 years' silence breaking at last, until the child who had not spoken filled the warming house with the chatter of a 6-year-old who has a great deal saved up to say. The talk below stairs, and then the talk in the county, ran the way such talk runs. They said the grim Duke of Aldermere had taken leave of his senses, that he was seen walking in the gardens with his housekeeper and a serving woman's child as if they were his own family, that there was music in the great house again, and the windows thrown open, and the fountain set running in the spring. The neighbors, who had pitied him for 3 years, now found something to disapprove of, because the world will always rather pity a man than see him happy with the wrong person, and a duke who loved where his housekeeper stood was very much, in their eyes, the wrong person. There were those who came to call in the warm weather, the fine families with their fine pale daughters, who had circled the grieving widower for 3 years like patient birds, and who now saw the prize about to fall to a gray-gowned nobody. And they did what their kind does. They were cold to Margaret in the drawing-room. They spoke past her as if she were furniture. One great lady, a marchioness with a daughter to settle, said to the Duke at his own table, in Margaret's hearing, with a thin, sweet smile, that it was so very tender of him to take an interest in the little servant's girl, and that of course a man in grief might attach himself to the nearest comfort, but that he must think of his name, of his blood, of what was owed to his line. For a housekeeper was a housekeeper when all was said, however pleasant. The room went quiet. Margaret kept her eyes on her plate and her hand still, for she had learned long ago not to fight on ground the world had chosen. But the Duke set down his glass. He was not a man who had spoken much in 3 years, and the county had grown used to a silent, broken man. And so what he did then was the more remarkable for it. He looked at the Marchioness, and he said quietly, "You are right, my lady. A housekeeper is a housekeeper, and I could find 100 women of better blood to grace this table." He paused, and the room waited. "But I searched the whole of my house and the whole of my grief for 3 years for one person who could make it possible to live. And I found exactly one. She is sitting at my table now in a gray gown. The day she walked up my drive with a silent child was the day my life turned back toward the light, though I was too deep in the dark to see it." His voice did not rise, and somehow that made it land the harder. "A name is a fine thing, my lady, but I have learned what a silent house is worth, and I will not buy a fine name with another 3 years of it." He turned to Margaret then, in front of all of them, and he did not lower his voice. "I would be honored," he said, "if you would consent to be my wife." There was no triumph in Margaret's face. That was the thing the Marchioness could not forgive afterward, and could not understand. The gray woman did not gloat, did not flush with victory, did not look once at the fine family she had bested. She only looked at the Duke, this man she had watched come back to life across a long winter, and her eyes filled, and she said simply, "Yes." And that was all. She did not need the room to lose. She had never been playing against the room. They were married in the early summer, in the small parish church that stood within the park, and it was not the great society wedding the county had expected and was disappointed by. It was a quiet ceremony, with the household for witnesses and the dowager in the front pew with her sharp eyes wet, and old Hollis, the steward, standing very straight in his best coat, with a look on his tired face that no one had seen there in years. And when the vows were said and the register signed, there was music. Of course there was music, the church filling with it, the organ and the voices, in a house of God that had nothing to forbid. But the moment the whole county would speak of for years after was not the vows. It was what came before them. For as the bride came up the aisle in a gown of soft dove gray, not white, the color she had always worn, the color of survival, made it last into the color of a wedding. A child walked before her scattering early roses, a dark-eyed girl of 6 in a new pale frock, and the child was singing. She sang the whole way up the aisle, clear and small and unafraid, a soft falling lullaby that no one in the church but the groom had ever heard, the song of a woman 3 years in the family vault, sung now by a living child at the wedding of the man that woman had loved, given back to him not as grief, but as blessing. And the Duke of Aldermere stood at the altar and listened to the end of it, and he did not look away, and he did not break, though his eyes shone. And when the child reached him, she put up her arms, and he lifted her in front of the whole county, and held her while her mother came the last few steps, and the 3 of them stood together where a man had stood alone for 3 years, and the house of Aldermere, through its open doors, breathed in the music and let it go, and was, at last, allowed to live. In the years that came, Aldermere was known across 3 counties as the house where there was always music. The pianoforte was never covered again. The fountains ran all summer. The deerhound Bran lived out his great age by the hearth and was buried when his time came, in the garden the Duke had once let go to ruin and had brought back to bloom. And the child grew, the silent child who had pressed one trembling key into 3 years of held breath, grew tall and merry and full of voice, and never again in her long life believed that her own song could do anyone harm, because she had seen with her own eyes on a gray March afternoon what her voice had truly done. It had not killed. It had walked into the heart of a sealed and frozen house and opened every window and taught a grieving man that the way to keep the ones we lose is not to fall silent after them, but to go on making in their honor all the sound and the love and the music they would have wanted the house to be full of. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to its end, and for sitting with us a while in the warmth of a house that learned to breathe again. Please tell us in the comments below which city or town you are listening from tonight, and what this story made you feel. And if it warmed you, do subscribe so that more of these quiet tales can find their way to you on the long evenings ahead. Until the next one, be gentle with yourselves and let your own house be full of music.